this would be the foundation of his entire politics from this point in this foundation as a young priest to later on when he becomes a fascist dictator. Hey folks, and welcome back to See You in Hell. This is a video series where I, Craig Johnson, am going to be celebrating the deaths of prominent right-wing figures in history. In this case, right-wing figures who died today, the very day that I'm releasing this, April 17th. In this case, I'm talking about the former fascist dictator, Catholic priest, and Holocaust participant, a guy named Jozef Tiso. Jozef Tiso was born in what was at the time the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1887. He was extremely religious and was Hungarianized, as per the norms at the time. Now, in order to explain exactly what was going on there, in the mid-19th century, there was a revolution in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Hungary, the Hungarian part of the empire, gained a lot of autonomy. However, they only had about half of their population was actually ethnically Hungarian. Jozef Tiso was part of a Slavic, specifically a Slovak minority in that new Hungarian state, but he and his family were part of this like Hungarianization push. This is important for later when he becomes like a symbol of nationalism because he began his life as a multi-ethnic type person. His father was also named Jozef Tiso, and he was a butcher from a family of wealthy farmers. His mother was from a family of clay workers. Jozef Tiso was born in Nagyobice on the 13th of October, 1887. He was the second of 7 children who survived infancy. His older brother was the other man in the family, and he also became a priest. All of his younger sisters did pretty well. They actually married pretty successfully, for a relatively lower class family. They were all laborers in the family. As I said before, the Tiso family was deeply involved in what was at the time the main way that you could be sort of like socially upwardly mobile in the new Hungarian side of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They were Hungarianized. His family spoke Slovak at home, but they sent their kids to school in order to learn Hungarian because that was the way to move up in the world. Tiso ended up being extremely successful in school, especially in languages. He was very good in his Hungarian classes and his Latin classes. And at the push of his mother, he became a priest. He moved into the priesthood. He was deeply involved in the Catholic Church, which was really important for the Hungarianization of this part of the world, right? The idea was like, well, if ethnicity can't bring us all together, then maybe religion can, right? Maybe people can come together because of their religious connections here. That was the idea. So he attended a local Catholic grammar school. He attended a large middle school that was actually pretty far away from his family. And then he attended a prep school, which was a prep seminary, right? The idea was that it was going to prepare people for the priesthood. This was in a town called Nitra, which had a history as being a seat of Slavic, specifically Slovak, national pride. However, Nitria was also a place that had a large Jewish community. This was really Tiso's first encounter with a pretty sizable and powerful Jewish minority in a territory. And because of the fact that this was also his first big association with large Jewish populations, this is also where we see Tiso expressing his deeply held and essentially lifelong anti-Semitism. Now at this point, he's still school age, right? But he's doing extremely well in school. He was drawn very closely and personally to the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola and Summa Theologia of Thomas Aquinas. Now, these are oldie-time Catholic thinkers that I'm not really going to get into right now, but the point is that Tiso was deeply drawn to Catholic religious thinking, and this would be the foundation of his entire politics from this point in this foundation as a young priest to later on when he becomes a fascist dictator, right? All of this to him is part of his Catholicism. Eventually, in school, he has a youthful turn towards a kind of Catholic politics. Catholic politics, back in the early 20th century, meant like social conservatism, but also some degree of social welfare spending, right? Catholic politicians wanted there to be a social welfare net in order to catch people from falling, too deep down any kind of organizing rabbit hole that might turn them into communists, right? That was more or less one of the explicit goals here, but it was also out of like a, earnest, in their opinion, Christian belief in the need for social spending and welfare and, providing for people, right? And so those are Tiso's politics on a fundamental level. He's critical of capitalism because he thinks that it exploits and hurts people, but he's also critical of communism because it's atheistic and, in his opinion, also associated with Judaism. Eventually, Tiso, and part of his success, moves from the sort of like small rural world of the Slovakian part of the Hungarian part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He moves straight to the heart of the empire. He goes straight to Vienna. This is after the completion of his education in order to begin his earnest priestly studies. This was a site of extreme modernity, right? This is the early 20th century in Vienna. Vienna is one of the hearts, the beating hearts of the modern world. A real contrast to the kinds of backwoods stuff that Tiso has been living through before. He leaves Vienna shortly after for his first sort of like priestly postings were all the way back in the rural areas that he lived in all his life. So far his life has been one of contrasts, right? He's going from extreme rural relative poverty to sort of like rural seats of power, encountering the kinds of Jewish minorities that he would eventually consider to be his social enemies. He's moving to the seat of the modern world in Vienna, and then he's coming right back to rural areas, right? This was all interrupted. The entire world that he grew up in was interrupted in 1914 by the outbreak of the First World War. Tiso, like basically every other young person of his age in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, had been in the reserves. And when the war breaks out and the Austro-Hungarians declare war on the Serbians and then bring in the Germans, which brings in the Russians, which brings in the French, which brings in the UK, and that starts the war, right? Tiso is then called up. He joins the 71st Trenčín's Infantry Regiment as a chaplain, because remember, he's a priest. This man is wearing a collar, right? He's a Catholic priest. So he's a chaplain and also a captain. This was a privileged position in the war. It meant that he got a horse. It meant that he had a servant. But Tiso was a bad rider and not a particularly physically fit man throughout the entirety of his life, so he mostly sat in the wagon. He was a privileged person in the war. Like I said, he wasn't actually jumping over the trenches and shooting people, but he was pretty vulnerable because it meant that he needed to be there to administer last rites to people when they were dying. And where do people die? Well, they die on the front. They die in the trenches. So Tiso was getting shot at, right? He was in a difficult situation. He served as a confessor, mostly to Slovak-speaking soldiers, and as a liaison between Slovak-speaking soldiers and their Hungarian or German-speaking officers. In his memoirs about the war, he talked about the horrors of the war, seeing terrible atrocities, bodies maimed, people who had lost both of their hands, worried about what was going to happen to their families and their children when they couldn't work anymore. Tiso had no temperament for the front. He was eventually granted sick leave by one of his superior officers, another priest, and was sent back to a life of normalcy, back behind the front lines. This is partly due to the success of the publication of his war diary, which has some pretty disturbing elements that actually presage what he would eventually become, a sort of like fascist demagogue, right? He talks about the war as, quote, an educational instrument of divine providence. It's creepy stuff, right? As the war draws to a close, he joins a Catholic party, the Catholic Populist Party, in 1917. These people were opposed to the left, specifically to the Social Democrats, whom they were worried were going to be taking over Hungary. The Social Democrats being kind of socialists, like, but kind of like almost kind of way, right? The other main thing that happens after World War I is that the entire social universe, the entire socio-political universe that Tiso has been raised in and prepared himself for, collapses. The Austro-Hungarian Empire disappears. And it's not like, okay, well, now he's just going to be this, cultural Hungarian living in a big old Hungarian state. No, he's not even in Hungary anymore. And it's not even entirely certain where any of the towns that he has been in, what places they're going to be in, because immediately after World War I, the multi-ethnic, multinational, multilinguistic, multi-religious empire that was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it gets divided up into nation states, right? And where those borders are drawn confuses a lot of people, right? You end up with Poles that live in Hungary and Czechs that live in Hungary and Hungarians that live in Romania and yada, 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 right? Everybody's sort of living everywhere. And the question is, well, how do you build national identity from the ruins of an empire that was essentially founded on opposing it, right? And this is the answer, this is the question that Tiso is going to end up trying to answer for the rest of his life. So he's a Hungarianized Slovak in the new Czechoslovakian Republic. Czechoslovakia has been combined between, the Czech peoples and the Slovak peoples. This was essentially in order to make sure that there was big enough countries in order to stand up against Germany, which has also been severely hurt by the conclusion of World War I. At this point, Tiso was deeply involved in politics, deeply involved in Catholic politics, but was increasingly turning into a Slovak nationalist, something that hadn't really been a part of his political expression before this. And already, even under the immediate aftermath of World War I, even already now, Tiso is a pretty open anti-Semite. As early as 1919, he's publishing articles that are called "What Do We Do with the Jews?" It's pretty clear, right? He defends his anti-Semitism. He says that his anti-Semitism is Christian, and that it stems from a Christian love of self. Like, this is pretty gross. Here I'm quoting him, specifically quoting "What Should We Do with the Jews?" This article that he wrote in 1919. He says, "Would it be Christian to let them, that is Jewish people, rob, to let them use, to let them oppress?" Like, this is pretty gross, right? He's an anti-Semite. Eventually, in the early 1920s, he experiences the real divide in his political life. Is he going to pursue a priestly career, or is he going to pursue his political career? He ends up choosing politics. He makes a pretty calculated choice to turn away from such open anti-Semitism, essentially for electoral reasons, in the early 1920s, but this does not stop him from being an anti-Semite. Like, this is how he thinks about the world. Eventually, he joins the party that he would end up being the head of and end up using as his political backing for his eventual sort of like quasi-fascist government. This is the Ludak Party. He rises through the rank of the Slovak People's Party, which is the Ludak Party, which is also originally led by a different Catholic priest, a man named Hlinka. The paramilitary of the Ludak Party, the Hlinka League, is eventually named after this dead Catholic priest. Tiso eventually works his way up through the ranks and eventually leads some of the government offices under the Ludak Party. And it was here that he really develops himself as a Slovak nationalist. He pushes for Slovakian autonomy, separation from the Czech parts of the Czechoslovakian state, possibly even separation from the Czech parts of the state. He continues his rise through the political world, triangulating with Adolf Hitler, who has, by this point in the early 1930s, tried to take parts of Czechoslovakia, right? So in the early 1930s, Adolf Hitler pressures Czechoslovakia to give ethnically German occupied parts of Czechoslovakia to Germany, and the rest of the European political world accedes to these demands. They say, sure, you can just take them. We don't want a big war or anything. However, of course, when it comes to fascism, if you don't oppose them when they make their demands, they just come back and make more demands, and eventually World War II happened, arguably partly because Adolf Hitler was appeased in this capacity. Tiso does not see this as a problem. He sees it as an opportunity. And he and Slovakia pursue a partnership with Adolf Hitler against the Czechs. In 1938, immediately before the outbreak of World War II, at least in Europe, Tiso secures Slovak autonomy inside of Czechoslovakia. This coincides with Ludak, his party's superiority in the area, and it also coincides with Tiso's own control of that party organization. Tiso is now a Slovakian leader in charge of the Slovakian peoples. Eventually, as World War II breaks out, he becomes the president of Slovakia, a new territory, after Czechoslovakia is invaded by the Germans as part of their attack on the Poles. He is independent as a German client state, which means that he exists basically by virtue of the acceptance and kindness of Adolf Hitler and his Nazi state. Tiso pursued a really personal connection with Adolf Hitler, which is exactly how you can operate with, dictators and other sort of like personalist type leaders. That's how you do it. And so by World War II, we have Jozef Tiso, a Catholic priest. Again, he's still a priest, still wearing a clerical collar. He's the president of an independent Slovakia. And he is a close friend and ally of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. He steps back from everyday ruling in order to focus on diplomacy and the things that matter to him, which it turns out some of those are deporting Jewish people in order to be mass murdered. Now, this is where this video is going to run into any Slovak nationalists who may or may not be listening. Jozef Tiso voluntarily participated in the Holocaust. There are ample ample amounts of documentation about this. We have quotes from Adolf Hitler, from Adolf Eichmann, from other top Nazis saying that they were, quote unquote, surprised. That's their word, that they were surprised that the sitting Catholic priest was willing to work with them on their plans to kill Jewish people. Now, Tiso believed that what he was doing was participating in a compromise with Germany in order to secure the independence and safety of the Slovakians. But of course, in his mind, that is a separate category from the Jewish people who live in Slovakia. How did Tiso participate in the Holocaust? Well, as the president of Slovakia, he worked with Germany in order to secure a deportation program. Deportation was the euphemism. It was the dog whistle that the Nazi German state used in order to explain away and write down on official pieces of paper what they were doing to Jewish people. They used this euphemism up till the very end, up to the point where they were gassing people and putting people in mass graves, even to the point of calling those mass graves deportation pits. That's official Nazi parlance for these things. Tiso hid, both politically and personally psychologically, behind these falsehoods. He liked calling these policies deportation policies and even convinced himself that they were in some way humane, to the extent that he even actually felt good about the fact that the Slovakian deportation policy involved deporting entire families together because he didn't want them to be separated. Tiso justified this with his Catholicism. He thought that this was an act of national security, and like I said before, his quotation of the self-love, the Christian self-love expressed by Slovakian people doing this for their own. These actions began in 1942 as the Germans demanded of all their client states and all of their occupied states to hand over Jewish people in order to be either enslaved or killed. Like I said, Slovakian nationalists dispute this, but again, there is proof that he met with Germans, that he attended conferences with German organizers of the Holocaust. He knew about it. He helped it happen. He didn't stop it. Jozef Tiso, therefore, deserves a name, a moniker. He is a collaborator. A collaborator means somebody who works with somebody who perpetrates a massive evil. Usually it's somebody who is a fascist or is a Nazi or is committing a genocide or something like that. A collaborator is somebody who works with them, who aids and abets them. Maybe they believe in the cause, maybe they don't. Maybe they think that they're securing their own safety. Maybe they, just think that this is a way that they can make a buck, right? A collaborator is somebody who works with somebody who's committing a real terrible atrocity. Whether or not they believe in the atrocity, they're going along with it. Tiso's bargain with the Nazis is relatively short-lived, however, because the Nazi state is relatively short-lived. Already by 1943, the alliance between the new Slovakian state and the Nazi German state is fraying. This is because Nazi Germany is losing the war. The Soviets are pushing in from the east, the Americans have arrived and are pushing in North Africa and up through Italy. No longer are the Slovakians getting anything from the bargain, but they still have to go along with it because the Germans are just too powerful, and by this point, they've hitched their wagons to them. There's no going back. At this point, Jozef Tiso, as his biographer states, had switched from being a Catholic Slovak statesman to a discredited Nazi collaborator. In 1944, the Germans occupy and take over the emerging front with the Soviets and take over and occupy their erstwhile supposed ally, taking off the mask entirely and just revealing themselves to be using the Slovakians in order to achieve their own goals. Eventually, in 1945, Tiso is condemned by the Pope, who at this point is no longer under the thumb of the other major fascist dictatorship in Europe, Benito Mussolini, having been deposed by the Allied invasion of Italy. Tiso eventually escapes, runs away. He tries to escape Slovakia in 1945, but he is captured by US soldiers and sent back to the newly established Czechoslovakia after it had been liberated by the Allies. This new Czechoslovakia was run not by his buddies, but by the resistance, the people who had been opposing him, opposing his participation in the Holocaust, opposing his friendship with Adolf Hitler. During his trial, Jozef Tiso said that he had done what he had done in order to shield the Slovak people from German aggression. This is classic collaborator justification, arguing that what he did was only because it was the lesser evil, not because he really believed in it. But as I've said, we know from his own writing, from his own political motivations, from his own activity, that Jozef Tiso was a lifelong anti-Semite. He really believed that Jewish people were not deserving of the same kind of protections and freedoms that other people were, and specifically that Gentiles were. For his crimes against humanity and his crimes against his own countrymen, Jozef Tiso was sentenced by a military sort of resistance tribunal to death by hanging. However, Tiso, like I said, a lifelong, relatively unhealthy person, was too big to be hanged by the systems that they had left, and so his hanging had to be somewhat improvised. He was hoisted up by his armpits with a big rope, and had two other ropes tied to him, one around his neck and one at his feet. The idea was that they would hoist him up by his armpits, and then they would slacken that, and then a rope tied at his feet would have a big weight, and that would snap his neck. This was botched, and instead Jozef Tiso hung there strangling for several minutes until he died of suffocation. As the first Slovak leader, as the first leader of an independent Slovakia, Jozef Tiso today is still remembered by some Slovak nationalists as a national hero. Some of these people include the People's Party Our Slovakia, which is a basically open fascist Slovakian political party that operates in that country today. It doesn't have any national representation as of the time that I'm making this video in April of 2025, but it does have several local seats. However, other people more accurately remember Jozef Tiso as a clerico-fascist, somebody who is a priest but who believed in a kind of fascism and who participated in the Holocaust very willingly. And so, Jozef Tiso, we will see you in hell.